You're listening to Just a Dude podcast with your host, Nathan. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Let's roll. Yo, what's good, everybody? Welcome back to Just a Dude podcast, where we keep it real, raw, and just a little bit righteous. I'm your host, Nathan, just a dude trying to figure out life, faith, and maybe how to make a decent cup of coffee. Today, we've got a special treat. Dr. David Chotka is back for his second appearance on the show. If you caught him last time, you know this guy's the real deal. A pastor, author, and the founder of Spirit Equipped Ministries, who's preached in 17 countries and written books like Healing Prayer that hit you right in the soul. We're diving into what's new with David, from his latest prayer adventures to stories from his Ukrainian roots. So grab your headphones and let's get into it with my man, Dr. David Chotka. All right, David, welcome back to the show. Last time we got into your wild journey from your parents' Ukrainian restaurant to teaching the world about prayer, and I'm pumped to have you back. So if you wouldn't mind, just update our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Well, hi, my name is David Chotka. I am the founder and director of a Canadian charity with actually an American 501c3 too. 501c3 as well. Anyway, the bottom line is I teach, I write, I travel. And actually, I'm going to be helping out a local church here to carry themselves through a 3-month window. So I am not retired, but I'm no longer the lead pastor of a local church. I was from 1983 until 2020. So wow. That was my life before that, but always, all through this, right from 84, right through to the present day, I would combine my work in a local church by helping out other regions on the planet or other regions inside the country with a small congregation that wanted a hand, or an international field that needed some propping up, some help, some spiritual support. I've been doing that since I was ordained. So there you go.
Awesome. Thank you. And, so the audience knows, Dave, this is Dr. Chotka's second time back on the show, and we're so glad to have him. Hopefully, David, you'll become a staple, or our spiritual guru, so to speak. But, in reality, we're just two dudes that are kind of catching up, but we're also going to dive deep into faith, prayer, and life. And, one of the things that I wanted to catch up with, I think the last time we spoke, Dr. Chotka, you were about to go on a mission. So do you want to share a little bit about what happened and where you went?
Well, I did two of them, one in February and then one again in June. And in February, I went to the Philippines and Cambodia. And sorry, my apologies. Yes, Philippines and Cambodia. And in the second time through, I went from the Philippines again a second time and then to Vietnam. And just before that, I'd been to Vietnam as well. So it's a really strange kind of combo of all these different things. So lots of Asia trips in particular. And I've done some local events here in Canada as well. I'm a Canadian. And so most of my work is either in Canada or abroad, one or the other.
Yep.
Actually, more international than local, to be straight with you.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like lately you've been doing more international specifically, but I know, even last time we talked about you going to Ukraine and, so you've really been all over the world with your teachings, haven't you?
So far, 21 nations.
Wow. That's awesome.
There's a couple of other possibilities coming up in the new year. I'm going to be going to the Middle East. I've never done that before. That would be new to me.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. It's a different time there now, too. And hopefully, we're going to see a little bit more peace in that region. But, definitely, I know they can use your help of spreading the word for sure.
Well, the hope and the prayer is that be so. That it's always been an area where there's been some kind of conflict or turmoil. And you were talking about biblical history. You're not just talking about recent events. There's always been some sort of a battle going on between this nation or that nation. And the strange thing, I don't know if you remember this. There was the time where Terry Waite was kidnapped at the same time as an American journalist was captured. They were held captive by Muslim fundamentalists. Terry Waite found it really difficult to continue because he said they're all related to each other and they're always fighting each other.
Yeah, yes, they are. I mean, if you think about it, I'm sure your lifetime, Dr. Chotka, and my lifetime as well, which is maybe just a year or two more brief than yours, right? But it's always been conflict in that region. And it would be, it would be so nice if we could have some long lasting peace and, see what happens. But again, time will tell, right?
Well, that's the prayer. At any rate, the bottom line is I just did this. I spoke as the main speaker for the General Assembly of the Christian Missionary Alliance in the Philippines. And there were 4,000 pastors in attendance at the event, together with other leaders as well. That was an
Wow.
amazing experience. And the thing was interesting, exciting, was that's my denominational tradition. And so I wound up in with a group of people who, and they actually, even though they speak with a Tagalog accent, they were using the same words and phrases, and their meetings were similar to what I was used to, and so on. It wasn't a great leap in my mind to understand how the business was to be carried out. But I got to talk and teach, and I brought a bunch of my healing prayer books with me, and all of them.
Nice.
Then I wound up speaking at a Pentecostal event, and then in Manila, and then I wound up going to Hanoi, Vietnam. And actually, if I got it beside me, I can't remember if I do right now or not. One of my books was translated into Vietnamese, and that's the big, thick, black one that you have. That book has been translated
I'll
into.
show it so everybody.
Yes,
This one, right?
yes, putting out the Lord's Prayer line by line. So that book, there's an interesting story attached to that. About 3 years ago, I was invited just after COVID was sort of settling down. I was invited to do a pastors' conference in Australia, and then there was a church that was in Brisbane, about an hour and a half flight north of there. And while I was there, it was an English Caucasian congregation, but there was one Vietnamese lady in attendance. And when I was at the pastors' conference in Sydney, the husband of that lady invited me to come for lunch on a Tuesday. And I walked into this house, and it was hilarious. Here's what happened. That they had 4 children, and the oldest daughter was somebody who was studying theology. And she looked at me and she said, "I can't believe you're in my living room. You teach on this." And she named an area. And I said, "Yes, I do." She said, "You do that on YouTube." I said, "Yes, I do." She said, "You do that online." I said, "Yes, I do." And then she said, "We got an apartment in the back area here. You could stay here and I could learn from you." Then she pulled her phone out. She asked me deep theological questions and started taking videos. And then she realized she had mistaken me for another guy. As it turned out, we look alike and we teach in the same areas. And
Wow.
I have a social media presence and he has a social media presence. And so it was actually everything she was saying was parallel in my life. I did it in the Canadian branch. That fella did it in the Australian branch. Anyway, the bottom line was we had this fun moment.
That
Then,
is so. Yeah.
well,
Think about what the odds of that would be, right?
the
For
thing
her
that
to think
happened
that, and yeah.
the thing that happened next was where the odds were crazy. So what they didn't know was that I had received an invitation from the president of the Australian branch to speak at a Pacific region thing with 26 different national leaders inside this context, and it was going to be held somewhere in Southeast Asia. I said, "Oh, isn't that nice? I accept the invitation. Thank you very much." And he gave me the dates, and I wrote them down and all that kind of thing. And so this girl who realized that I was the wrong guy talked to me over this meal. She said, "I got to learn from you." And she invited like a dozen of her friends. And all these
Wow.
Vietnamese people showed up at this event that I was teaching in the white church. And they start taking copious notes. And then they walked up to me, and 2 of them, the mother and the daughter, said, "Is this material available in Vietnamese?" I said, "Not at this point. This might be a rough translation out there." They said, "Well, if it's not in Vietnamese, we'll translate it. And then we're going to get it to Vietnam."
Nice.
And I said, "Oh, that's amazing. That's incredible." And here's what happened. The event that I was invited to by the president of the denomination turned out to be located in Vietnam itself. And so they invited me to get this book done in Vietnamese while I was being invited a year later to go to Vietnam itself. And so
Wow.
I wound up on the ground with the translation done by a bunch of people who were meticulous in trying to get this thing completed. And I was able, so we fundraised and we were able to get the books paid for. And we gave away 3,000 copies of that book to the Vietnamese branch of my denomination.
Oh, that's awesome.
Well,
That's fantastic.
so until recent history, that book, the Christian books were not allowed in, but if you printed them in country, they would barely accept them unless there was any kind of criticism of communism. And so the book got done, it got translated, got printed in country. And then I discovered something else. The people in the North didn't like the people in the South, and the people in the South didn't like the people in the North. It's sort of like the Americans after the Civil War.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
The South was attached to, in the Vietnam War, it used to be called Saigon. It's now called Ho Chi Minh City. And
Hmm.
they related differently to the group that they partnered with the Americans, and the group in the North partnered with the Chinese. And so
Yes.
there was this crazy kind of conflict, and the wound is still there. And
Yeah. It's
so,
so crazy how long those wounds last, isn't it?
yeah. and they haven't forgiven each other yet. There's still this mistrust. They have their guards up. If they have forgiven each other, they don't trust each other. Anyway, the point is that I did not realize this, but when those 3,000 books were distributed, it didn't include the Northern Branch. And so I wound up in conversation with the president of the Northern Branch, and there's another 3,000 pastors up there. And so we gave away those books in this last trip. And
Nice.
so it's in their own language. And now the Northern Branch and the Southern Branch, who speak the same language and belong to the same denominational association, have received the training that they need to receive. And it was done because people were generous and somebody paid my airfare to get there. It was the most incredible thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing because I have to imagine, Dr. Chaka, that with all your travel, if you had to pay for that yourself, right, out of your own pocket, you'd probably only have been to one other country, right? Just like me.
Well,
I sit there and look and I go, man, travel is so expensive and to go all these places. And I know that after talking with you on our first episode that, you've not only do you go to places, right, you probably fly to a metropolis type area, but then you go even deeper because you don't just stop there. You go into into the jungles, into the far end cities that a lot of people don't get to. So yeah, that's got to take a lot of effort, time, and money to do all that.
It does. And the thing that's amazing is the way that the Lord provides. God sends the money. God sends the resources. In fact, in this last trip, let me just tell you this last trip. So in the first trip, when I was in Ho Chi Minh City, I realized when I was there that the North and the South didn't talk to each other. I had a surplus in the fund to be used directly for Vietnamese translation. There was a surplus there. And so in Canada, you have to account for every dollar in your charity. And if you have a designated fund for a particular cause, you have to spend it on that cause. You can't spend anything else.
Sure, makes
Otherwise,
sense. Yeah.
well, your tax number is revoked then if you don't do that. Anyway, the bottom line was I had this surplus. I didn't know what to do with this. And then I discovered that there was this connection with the North, and could we get this done and give it away in the North? And I've been invited to the Philippines, and a trip from Manila to Hanoi is about a $300 bill. That's not that expensive. And a trip from Toronto to Hanoi, wow, thousands,
That's
right?
expensive.
That's expensive. I was already on the ground, and here's what happened: I had no peace about booking the short flight from Manila and back to Hanoi and back to Manila, so I could go fly back to Canada when I was done. No peace. And then I remembered that I had to get this done. My wife was bothering me because she was invited to come with me. She was saying, David, if we don't get these tickets, the price is going to go up. This is going to be nutty. You're going to be in trouble. And it was within 3 weeks of the trip, and I still had not yet done this. And it was because I had no peace about being on the ground in Vietnam when I didn't have somebody who could help me translate that I knew. And as it turned out, the two translators had met together on the day when I was about to book the ticket. I had something happen where I couldn't actually get to my computer. I had to respond to something else. And so I came back later and I opened up my phone, and on my WhatsApp, there was a message from one of the translators saying, the two of us have prayed. We will meet you at the airport in Hanoi and get your hotel booked and translate for you while you're on the ground. And as it turned out, one of them had been invited to go to Cambodia, which is the neighboring country, and it costs $100 to fly from Cambodia to Hanoi. And I had my two translators on the ground. It
Nice.
was, yeah, but I mean, then I booked my ticket, the peace came, and I thank the Lord they were there because I don't
Yeah,
speak
the
English.
Lord gave you an answer without even right when you needed it.
Well, here's the reality. I speak some Spanish, I speak some French, I speak English, and I speak a little bit of Russian and Ukrainian. I don't have any training in Asian languages. And so when I landed there and these two ladies met us, the propriety was preserved because it was two ladies. My wife was with me, and that's one of the big issues in my life. You want to make sure you're not putting yourself in trouble where there
Right.
could sort of crazy compromise. Anyway, the bottom line was they had booked a hotel 100 yards from where I was going to teach. And so I was able to, and this hotel it was not high end by any means. It would be like a 2-star in the
Yeah.
state of
Yeah.
Canada, but it was safe and it was clean, and it was 100 yards from the building where I had to teach. And so it was very easy to manage the whole thing. And they made sure that I was completely understood. Here's what they did. I sent them my PowerPoints in advance. They actually translated even my PowerPoints and got them into Vietnamese so that
Well, that's
when I was
awesome.
teaching and being translated in real time, everybody could read what I was saying. So I mean, I couldn't have planned that if I tried.
No, and I mean just the fact that it just, came together so well like that, and then you had a surplus, right? Which you're like, "What am I gonna do with?" And then you find out about the North and the South, and you're like, "Oh, well, look at that. God already had a plan for it."
That's exactly what happened, and now I can, with an open heart and a full conscience, stare down Revenue Canada, and I can say to them, "Here's where the money was spent. This is how."
Exactly. It was
But this is for the airfare from to Hanoi. By the way, this is for the hotel. This is for the cost of the books. This is for the translator fee. This is for our transport. And here are the meals that happened when I was in country doing this. And of course, the meals were next to nothing. I mean, they cost almost nothing. The hotel cost, I think, $25 American a night. So it
wow.
was, it's pocket change. Usually it's 250 or something for something
Yeah, yeah,
decent,
you're absolutely right. Yeah, anywhere you go around the US or Canada, it's not
or
cheap
Europe,
by any ways.
or Australia, or any of these first
Yeah,
world
any
nations.
big pl yeah. Yep.
And I will tell
Wow.
you, it's interesting to see it. Vietnam's rising. I know that the American culture and the Vietnamese culture were clashing with each other during the war, and there was all kinds of stuff and so on. And there's still lingering stuff in the air about that. But Vietnam has good roads. It has high end vehicles. It's beginning to open up. And here's what happened. Until about 2004 or 5, it was very difficult to be able to get anything Christian at all in that country. You were not allowed, because, and it didn't matter if it was Christian or if it was Buddhist or if it was Baha'i. It didn't matter. Anything related to any kind of faith was regarded as sickness by the communist worldview.
Wow.
Then in 2004 or 5, Vietnam made the decision that it wanted to help its people by becoming an economy that was open to international markets. And so it forged relationships with Taiwan and with Singapore and with Malaysia and with Japan and South Korea and so on. And all of them required Vietnam to guarantee religious freedom. And so one of my translators, her name was Tao Win. When she was a little girl, she grew up in Vietnam. Her parents would take her to church. They would form a community. They get up to 300 people. Then the communists would arrest the pastor, put him in jail, and then persecute all the people, and they'd have to pick up and move. That happened to her 6 times in her life when she
Wow.
was a little girl, 6 times. And then her parents managed to emigrate to Australia, and they have freedom in Australia, and they are delighted to be there, and so on. But I mean, she saw the religious persecution and experienced it personally. And her pastor, every time she was in a church, her pastor was arrested every single time. There were
Wow.
6 times or 7 times where that happened in her life. So for her to be able to go back and to present Christian materials inside what was communist Vietnam was, how do I say this? It was a gift to her.
Yeah, I mean, you just thinking about it, I kinda got this feeling over me of like, wow, how advantageous is that to go from a place that was just so against it to now you can go and openly teach and talk about it and do all these things that you couldn't do, and we're only talking, what, David, 20 years, give or
About
take, that
2000,
they've had it?
about 2004 or 5, so yeah, about 20 years.
Yeah.
And there's still, communist hard party hacks in the background.
Sure,
They
sure.
don't want something to happen. But for the most part, because of marketing, this is an interesting thing. Because of marketing and because of Vietnam's desire to move from a primitive agricultural based economy to a world class economy, they forged relationships with nations that had religious freedom and had to guarantee the same. And as a result, people could then worship freely. And that was brand new to them. And when I started talking about persecution, and right now, I don't know if you remember this, I am Ukrainian by background. And so I have been to the Ukraine, and now it is being leveled by that thug dictator, Putin. And Trump has realized that he's been played by the boy. I'm thankful for that. And
Yeah,
he's
me
starting
too.
to, he's changing his tune on this. But regardless of this, I shared stories about people being under that kind of oppression when I was there. Every head nodded. Everybody who was over 30 nodded their heads. All the ones younger than that, this
Didn't know
was
it.
kind of
Yeah,
there, but not really there.
like they knew it happened but didn't really live it, right?
They had not experienced it, but that group over 30 did. And they all knew about it. So it was that was an amazing kind of an important session for realizing that the freedom we have is earned. And you shouldn't be throwing away your freedom. You should be creating opportunity to create more of it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so funny because I was going to say, and I forgot to say it, David, but a happy belated Canada Day. And we had the 4th of July, and that's what made me think of it because we're surprisingly, you and I are close because I think you're in Ontario, right? In that
Oh, yeah,
province.
whereabouts are you?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and I'm in Ohio, so we're pretty close. We're
you're
not
across
far
the
away at
water.
all.
Okay.
Yeah,
Are you in
exactly.
Cleveland?
We just go across the lake, we'll be fine.
Yeah, honestly, because I'm on the north shore of Lake Erie. You're on the south shore.
I'm on the South Shore. Yeah, I'm 45
Are you in
minutes
Cleveland?
south of Cleveland.
Well, there you go. Listen, so that I could wave at you. I've
You
been
can, yeah, but
I've been to Cleveland.
yeah,
I've done
that's what I
events.
thought. Yeah, that's what I thought about when you said freedom, because a lot of people, I think, in both of our countries, take the freedoms and the opportunities that we have for granted, and we don't really realize, you know, how lucky we are to have the freedoms that we do and the ability, like you said, freedom of religion. Now, of course, you and I are both Christians, and that's our religion. But the fact that religions can come and go within our countries, and you think about places like Vietnam, like you said, and they've only had that freedom for 20 years,
The bottom line is, in
and
America, if you decide to be a Christian, that's fine. If you decide not to be a
yeah,
Christian, it's fine. If you decide
exactly.
to investigate Baha'i, it's fine. If you want to look at what it means to be a Buddhist, that's fine. In that country, even the right to have that conversation was alien to people until 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So
It's just
that's
that, yeah, we take
it's
that for
not
granted, don't we?
lucky.
Yeah,
You said it's lucky. It's not. It's earned.
it is.
Decisions were made back in the day that freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly would be guaranteed by your constitution and by mine. And
Exactly.
so
Yeah, I mean,
this,
if you look at the Constitution of the United States, these are God-given human rights. That's how
yes,
they look at it.
Thomas Jefferson was not really a Christian. He was what you call a deist. So if you took Thomas Jefferson's New Testament, he would keep the moral teaching of Jesus, but he would have cut out all those other miracles.
Yeah,
He didn't believe
exactly.
in supernatural miracles. In regards to that, he believed in freedom of conscience. And so when he penned the Declaration of Independence, inside the language was this inalienable right to be able to pursue however you wanted to pursue happiness. It was just start part and
Yep.
parcel of that. And
Yeah,
so it's not luck, it's earned.
it is.
Somebody's blood was spilled to guarantee that right.
And not only that, but it not only does it have to be earned, but we have to actively work to keep it, because there are places throughout this world, where you could definitely see the devil at work trying to go against our way of life, you know?
It's true. It's true. But regardless of that, the trouble with our culture is
Yeah.
there's a byproduct to freedom. The byproduct to freedom is material prosperity. And when material prosperity is put next to freedom of faith, freedom of expression, etc., freedom of assembly, it leads to a place where you start to choose things that are bad as well as good. And so you have right inside the framework of both of our countries a rise of evil as well as a rise of good. They're both beside each other, side by side. Anyway, in my mind, the bottom line is that I'm just thankful for the opportunity to be able to speak about these matters and to see where it goes.
Yeah.
And
And I
it's
love
good.
the fact that, living out the Lord's Prayer, you said that was the one that was translated. And I know haven't you had some other translations as well? Maybe not specifically for that book, but some of your other
I
items that you have?
Yeah, that book was put into French and Chinese and Urdu
That's
and
right.
now Vietnamese. So there's 5 languages for that book.
That's
And
awesome.
right now, I did a short form on the Lord's Prayer. I just got it done. I'm just right now doing the final edits on it. And that resource, it's called 6 Short Steps to Pray the Prayer. And
I
it's
love
about
it.
100-page book, and it's got application steps about how you can actually do this. That book is being given to a group called Transworld Radio Discipleship Essentials. They are making it free in the Philippines so that the pastors who are trained in the Philippines in the denomination I'm in, the Christian Missionary Alliance, those 4,000 pastors, get that resource at no charge. And so we just got that done just before my last trip. And what I did was I gave them, how do I say this? I gave them the first draft and they're test running it with a group of people. And after the test run, they will tell me what they think are the best edits for it, and we will improve the manuscript and then
I love
publish
it.
it to make it available.
Yeah.
So that just, we're talking just happened.
Nice.
So
No, that's
yeah.
that's awesome because, David, that's where I was going next is what do you have new that's coming up? So obviously we touched
Yeah,
on the
that's
short form.
that one's done. I've also in the works. There are 2 other manuscripts. So I have been working on a commentary on Mark's gospel, and I'm calling it Mark, comma, My Words.
Nice. Yeah, you know what? And I think we talked about that. I think you were just, I don't want to say just starting it, but you were working on it when we
I was
talked
working on it,
last
right?
time. So, yeah,
Yes.
that's
So
awesome.
I have finished the first run, and here's what just occurred. Like about a week ago, I sent a request to the Lockman Bible Foundation. I want to take a standard translation, the one I'm using is New American Standard, and put
Hmm.
it side by side with my paraphrase. And then in the introduction, I want to say there's value in paraphrase because you can examine something from a folksy kind of perspective. And there's value in a literal translation because you get at the original intention of the language. I'm going to put those two things in two columns, and then I'm going to have a little couple pages of commentary on each section. So that's in the works. It'll be done very soon. The
I
Living Out the
love
Lord's
that.
Prayer. Yeah, that's going to come out
Yeah.
soon. I have
Yeah.
another book where I'm talking about dealing with the powers of darkness. So, sharp temptation and dealing with the demonic reality and supernatural reality. I was most reluctant to consider writing that book, and I'll tell you why. When you start talking about devils and demons, crazy people think you're sane, and sane people think you're crazy.
It's so true.
So,
That is so
when you,
funny. You're absolutely
well,
right.
it's true. So,
Yeah.
Jesus, Jesus was an exorcist. He cast out demons. In fact, the founder of the Lutheran Church, Martin Luther, he was an exorcist. And John Paul II, the guy who was the Pope and spoke all those languages and was this amazing leader, he cast out demons from people. But you don't, if you say that in common conversation in Canada, the US, Australia, they will say, well, I could sell you a bridge. I got one over there. How
Exactly.
much money do you want for that? Anyway, so
And
I,
no, you're absolutely right because we think about it and a lot of people like to think of it in secular terms, right? Or in ways that we, whether it be psychiatry, right? Oh, if you're exercising a demon, no, 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 they just have schizophrenia or they have that or they have this, We always
you
try
know,
to scientifically prove it, but you're absolutely right. There is proof throughout the Bible that there was exorcism of demons. Jesus dealt directly with Satan himself, when he was wandering in the desert and so it's like it's there. You got to believe that it's real.
now there was somebody who bridged the gap, about 30 years ago, a guy named Scott Peck. He wrote a book called The People of the Lie. And what he did was he examined psychologically, psychiatrically, those people who were afflicted by evil. And what he decided was to put that title is interesting because the first assumption you'll make when you're talking about being infilled by something unclean is that the people of the lie are the ones who are infilled by the demonic force. He said people who don't believe that that kind of thing happens are the people of the lie.
Yeah.
And it's a famous book by L. Scott Peck. He was a doctor of psychiatry. And so he has got this research that's out, and it's old now. It's about 35 years old now. My own personal mentor was a man by the name of Dr. John White. He was a doctor of psychiatry at the University of Manitoba. He mentored me in pastoral care and how to help people who were dealing with various afflictions and so on. And I had direct tutelage from this amazing man. He had written at that point 21 books, and he was an international traveler. And he felt commanded of the Lord to fly on his own dime to my church in northern Alberta. It's an amazing thing. And then he said, the condition for my coming to your church is that I have to mentor you for at least a year, if not more. Anyway, I said, well, I sure is what I said when he offered me this. And he's written amazing books on discipleship. He wrote a book called The Fight that taught me how to be a disciple. And he wrote another book called Daring to Draw Near that taught me how to pray. And then he wrote a book on faith in the family. And he wrote a book on sexual purity. And he wrote a book on science fiction fantasy for children. He did all this kind of stuff. And he wound up, every time I was dealing with some substantive issue in my role as a pastor, there would be another John White book, and he became my friend. But this man also believed in medical analyses and the recognition that schizophrenia is real. By the way, various forms of mental affliction are real, and some of them have roots in the chemical imbalance in your brain and so on.
Hmm.
So I said to him one day, I said, look, John, I have a friend who thinks he's the king of Canada, and he wants to spend Canadian tax dollars by putting bicycle trails in the Arctic. What should I do about that man? I said, is, is he demonized? Is this real? Has he got a mental issue? And so I had this amazing conversation with him. And he said, well, if you confront the delusion and you say that you're not the king of Canada, he will jolly well tell you that he is and how he's going to spend his money. I said, you have to get him back on his medication so that he becomes balanced. I said, well, he's a believer. This is somebody I went to Bible study with. He talks about Jesus. He loves the Lord. And so he said, yes. And he has an imbalance in his chemical balance in his brain. And then he gave me this illustration. So he took his glasses off and he looked at me and he said, I can hardly see you now. And then he put his glasses back on. And he says, and now I can see you well. I'm not healed, but I'm helped when I wear my glasses. And then he said, when somebody is suffering from psychiatric delusion and they take their medicine, they're not healed, but they're helped. So let's take away the stigma that's attached to that. Well, so I said to this man, I said, look, John, what is the difference between mental illness and demonization? How do you know when you're dealing with something that is an invader spirit versus something that's a chemical imbalance? He said, David, if I have 100 people in my medical practice who are in therapy with me for psychotic or psychiatric delusion, 97 of the 100 can be helped by medicine. 3% of the 100 have either a combination of something unclean sitting on their delusion, and they can be helped by medicine, but there's something unclean there. And 1 out of 100 will be outright demonization. I said, what do you do when you're dealing with demonization?
Yeah,
He said,
exactly.
well, it's very simple. I get a signed release form from the people who are the family, the guardians of whoever
Yeah,
I'm
like the
dealing with.
caregivers.
Yes. And I make sure that they have the legal authority to give me this kind of permission. And then once I get a signed affidavit, I will pray with the patient. He said, if they are simply Christians who have a psychotic affliction and they need medicine, when I pray with them, they become calm, even if they stay in their delusion. If there is demonization, they become agitated, in which case I say, out you go in the name of Jesus, be gone. And if the unclean spirit then leaves, and the person becomes well, and somebody gets mad at me for doing that, I produce the affidavit.
Yeah,
With the
exactly. You gotta, yeah,
permission document.
it's a shame you got to
But
do that for everything now, isn't it?
well, what he told me is that 97 out of 100 cases are based in physiology. They're based in medicine. 3% are not. And of the 3%, 1% is outright demonization. 2% is where there's some sort of a genetic weakness or a biological factor that's at play where an unclean spirit rests on that. So I am writing a book on that reality too, which is something I
Yeah,
didn't
that's going to
want to
be,
do.
but you know what? That's going to be so interesting to look at it from that perspective because I think we've seen so many books, where we talk about these types of things from a what they quote unquote science side, right? But now we have an opportunity to look at it through the lens of the Bible and through what Jesus and God had taught us, and I think that's a great. It can't be bad. It can't be a bad thing, right? We've got to understand the way the Lord wants us to act.
Sure. Now, for example, I'll just say something. So Tucker Carlson said there was an attack by an unclean spirit being. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's about 6 months ago. He said that there were bite marks on his body and that this thing showed up in the middle of the night and bit him and attacked him and gave him all kinds of bad dreams and so on. Now that's a modern guy living
Yeah.
in 21st century America who is claiming that these unclean spirit beings attacked him, and the response of the media was mixed. The Christian media said, of course, we know exactly what you're dealing with and we can help you. The ones in the middle of the road gave the information and decided to let it sit there. People who were on the other edge attacked him as delusional. And so it was a fascinating kind of thing to watch how the different kinds of media responded to his claim that he had been attacked by an unclean spirit being in the night. So what do you do with that? I mean, the bottom line is, do you believe in the existence of the supernatural realm? Do you or do you not? Secular humanism says, or actually empirical thought says, only the things that can be ascertained by our five senses have reality. Everything else is delusion. And so, so that means if I can touch the table, that means the table's real. If I can see the window, that means the window's real, etc. Trouble is, your senses can deceive you.
Yeah. Oh, they sure can. Well,
You
even
go
look
on
at
a roller coaster ride, you're dizzy. You're not going to be able to perceive things correctly for about 15, 20 minutes. Because your physiology's been messed with. You can put a pencil inside a glass and you can see two pencils instead of one. So you can create optical illusions. You can create things that aren't reality. So how then can you say that your five senses are the basis upon which you can make these discernments and judgments.
Yeah,
The bottom line
exactly.
is empirical science goes so far and can go no farther. The other thing is you can't see love. You can see love in action. You can't see hate. You can see hate in action. You can't see a hunch when somebody has a hunch about something around that corner, but they're prevented from having a car accident because they hit the brakes before they got to that corner and this car came speeding through the red light. I mean, these kinds of stories are real.
Mm-hmm.
Is there supernatural guidance? I'm convinced of it. Let me tell you one that's really quite nice. This is a nice story. Okay. So my wife, she used to have FSH muscular dystrophy. She does not now. She was healed. So that's one of the stories in my healing prayer book. But her mother was my mother-in-law, and when we were just first married, my wife and I lived in Metro Vancouver, and I was studying at university there, and I was a part-time pastor. And my mother-in-law came to visit us because she wanted to. And the trouble was, FSH muscular dystrophy causes muscle weakness in your abdominal region, your face sags, and in the end, you can't lift your arms higher than your shoulders, and you have to lift your legs up to be able to go upstairs. FSH has become known now because the founder of Lululemon is afflicted with FSH muscular dystrophy. He was
Well,
afflicted
yeah.
with it and now having trouble going upstairs. And so he made a $100 million donation to the Muscular Dystrophy Association to look for a cure for that because it's genetic. Anyway, my wife had it. She doesn't have it now, but my mother-in-law had it, and she was trying to climb the stairs to get to the bathroom. There were 6 steps up and 6 stairs down to the 2 bathrooms in our side split house. And so there was not a bathroom on the main floor, which was a problem for my mother-in-law, but she wanted to see us as we were just married. So she's climbing up the stairs and she gets to the second last stair on the thing. And my wife, who is also afflicted with FSH muscular dystrophy, is right behind her. And my mother-in-law loses her balance and starts to fall backwards on these steps. And my wife tries to raise her hands up, but she's too slow because the muscles don't work the way they're supposed to. And both of them said, "Oh, dear Jesus, help." And suddenly there was an explosion of light. And both of them were picked up and found themselves on the top step.
Yeah, that's
And
amazing. If you
yes,
think
and
about
so
it, I mean, yeah.
I came. Now my mother-in-law was a godly, soft-spoken, quiet Scandinavian Lutheran. That this you got to know. Scandinavian culture is understated at the best of times. And so this would be a profound laughing fit. Watch.
Yeah.
that,
That was it.
that's
Yeah, just a couple of
how
corners go
understated.
up. Yep.
Yeah, and so always even keeled, always level, always very respectful, and always very understated. Anyway, so I come home after I was at my day at the university, and I walk in home, and my mother-in-law looked at me, and she never talked like this. She said, "Son, we had a miracle today." I said, "What happened?" And they described this thing. And years later, I've talked to my wife about this. I said, "What did it feel like?" She said, "It was like being in the sunshine when you're catching a nap on a cool day when the sun is streaming through the windows and you're lying on the couch." That kind of comfort, warmth, and being suddenly carried in complete safety and complete consolation. And then they knew that they were in a safe place, and my mother-in-law got to the bathroom. That's what happened. But I said, "Mom, was that an angel?" And she said, "Son, it was." And so there was this profound sense that they had been spared a very bad fall, which would have injured both of them. Mother-in-law
Yeah.
was already on the verge of a wheelchair, and after that, she was in a wheelchair. And so this whole thing about supernatural intervention, in this case for good, in this case for help, in this case for hope, became it's one thing to say, "Oh yeah, I believe in that. Isn't that nice?" It's another thing to have an encounter where you meet something like that in your real life and it saves you from trouble. Now that cannot be explained. There's no rational explanation with empirical thought to say, yeah, angels really do exist and they're there for our help. I mean, people talk about this in a superstitious kind of off-field, syrupy, sugary way. And the Bible doesn't talk that way. In fact, most of us know about the Christmas story. The angel shows up to Mary and tells her she's going to give birth to a child. She's a virgin, and it's going to happen. And all those Catholics out there and every kind of Protestant you can imagine all believes the story's true.
Yep. They
That's
do.
right.
Yep.
And yeah, and then you have the angel appearing to Joseph, and he says, "Oh, by the way, your girl who's a virgin is going to get pregnant, and God did it. That
Yeah.
must have been one big angel. Anyway,
Yeah. I mean,
everybody. Yeah. And then the angels show up in the sky and they tell everybody, the shepherds, they have to go and run and see the Christ child who's lying in swaddling clothes in a manger, you know. And so we accept those stories and we don't consider them delusional. But
you're
we
absolutely
we
right. Yep.
we question whether or not somebody's sane if they have an encounter like the one I just described.
Yep.
And of
No,
course,
you're
in this
absolutely
case,
right. And David, I was going to ask you, something about this too, because what do you do in those situations where you do, find yourself, you're a believer, you understand and know what you're supposed to do for God, but when you find yourself not believing, what do you do to help yourself to get, back on the right track?
straight up, I'm at the place where not believing is not an option.
I gotcha. But in talking about these people, how they say, they believe that it happened then, but not that it would happen today. You know what I mean?
Well, okay, I've met people like that, and they would say, "Oh yeah, that happened in the apostles' days," and that's fine for them. But we just have to deal with reality here now, that kind of thing. The bottom line is the Bible doesn't talk that way, and the way that I would describe it is I would use the Scripture itself to make the case that the last apostles, James and John, who
Mhm.
wrote books at the end of the New Testament, were actually training people to expect that kind of thing in the future. I would also go through church history and I would talk about significant leaders in the world stage who had supernatural encounters with the Lord. So, I mean, if you're a Wesleyan of any kind, all kinds of supernatural activity happened in the Wesley revivals. And that's in the 1700s. So, I
Mhm.
mean, from the time of the scripture right through to that time, there's all kinds of biblical characters who experienced miraculous events. So, St. Augustine, 5th century, he lived in the north part of Africa. And at that point, the Bible was already 400 years old, and he had not seen a healing miracle in his church. And so he just didn't believe that those things would happen. And so in early Augustine's writings, he talks about how those things just belonged to the days of the apostles and they weren't for us now. That's what he was saying. And then a young
Mhm.
lady got healed in his church. And she testified in her church, and within the next year, there were 50 miraculous healings in 1 year. So I would say St. Augustine was skeptical until he saw it, and then it happened in a common kind of a way. So let me tell you what happened to me. And I went to Uganda. I went on a mission trip to Uganda. It was there were two reasons for doing that. Number one, the north part of Uganda had been a war zone for more than 20 years, and here's what it meant: there was no medical care for 20 years. There was no dentist in the town to fix those teeth for 20 years. There was no education for 20 years. They did not have access to goods and services for 20 years. They were living in, they had to go into the jungle. And then there was this other character, Joseph Kony, who came in and did the child soldier thing where he made little boys and little girls hurt each other and then turned them into child soldiers. And North Uganda was in the middle of Idi Amin and Joseph Kony and this awful kind of ugly stuff. At any rate, there was a Ugandan preacher. He was a bishop. He planted 48 churches. I met him in Atlanta, Georgia. And he asked if I would prayerfully consider coming to Uganda and make a 3-year commitment to teach some of those pastors who had nothing for a very long time. My church would have to pay for the trip, but could I do this? Would I make this as part of my service? So I went back to my church board and they agreed that I would do this for 3 years. And they gave me a budget and so on. And I flew into Uganda, and it was my first experience of being in the middle of Africa. And it was poor. You got to know something. It was poor. And so there were about 750, 800 pastors, and I was training them in what I had learned about the Lord's Prayer pattern, the book that you held up.
Mhm.
And, I taught them for 3 years. And at the end of the 3 years, I created the book that you just held up, the black cover, and we gave it to them. So that church fundraised, and we gave away 16,000 copies of that book in Travel Society
Wow.
Africa because they'd not received training, and we wanted them to get that resource at no charge.
I'll hold it
So
up
that
again
was
just for
done.
the listeners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in those days, it was called Power Praying. That's a fresh title. It's called Living Out the Lord's Prayer Line by Line. And so the teaching of that book wound up going into that part of the world. Now, let me tell you what happened with this. There was also a crusade in the area. And so there were teachers from Norway and Canada and the United States. And so we were there together, checking out the ground and starting the process of setting up these schools. I wound up doing the northern part of an area called an area called Arua. An American congregation from New York wound up going into Gulu, and then the Atlanta congregation went to Kampala and Entebbe. Anyway, so we had these 3 sets of schools that we were teaching. And then they said, well, look, we got all these leaders. We're going to do an outreach campaign here thing. So there was a great big platform, and there were literally 50,000 people in that field while the choir was singing and people were walking because they had not had access to any kind of faith during the wartime. And now it was free and they could gather, and they assembled. And in that town called Arua, I took part in this outreach event. And here's what happened with the Canadians, Americans, and Norwegians. All of us had lighter skin, and we wound up under a canopy because it was equatorial heat. It's right on the equator. I don't know if you know, it's hot. And so
I'm
the
sure people
equatorial
like yourself and myself, David, would not do well in Africa long term,
sweating
would we?
profusely. Anyway, but, the people who lived there, it was no big deal for them, but for us, it was hard. Anyway, I wound up in this area under a canopy, and the very sick were brought to the front. The very, very sick, the ones who were on a stretcher, the ones who were on a pallet, the ones who were carried by their friends and put into a chair. And about 15, 20 feet from me, there was a paralyzed lady sitting on a dirty board. And this event started at 3:00 in the afternoon, and it went to 10 at night. And I watched that lady. I arrived there about 6:00, and she was sitting there. I watched her from 6 until 7 or 8. Her arms were paralyzed like this. Her head was leaned back. Her eyeball didn't open or close. There was no work operation with her eyelashes. I watched a fly climb up her chin and get to the corner of her eye and take a drink and then fly away. I mean, not even an eye blink, nothing.
Yeah.
And the preacher was on the platform talking about the gospel. And then suddenly he stopped and he said, "The healing anointing's upon me." And he walked down and he touched the arm of that lady. And then he went back to finish his message. She began to physically move. Now, I'd been watching her for hours, and I had watched that fly climb up her cheek and take a drink of water, a drink of a teardrop in the corner of her eye. And I watched that there was no response with her eyelid at all. She didn't even respond in any way. And it was very clearly a hopeless case. And then when he touched her, her hands began to move. Now, there was an African lady sitting just over from me. Her name was Elizabeth Queen, and we teased her by calling her Queen Elizabeth. Anyway, she walked up to this lady and began to rub her arms and to just gently hug her and touch her and pray for her. And she helped the lady sit up. And then she helped the lady stand up. And she'd not moved even a tiny micro muscle for the hours before that. It was this most incredible thing. And then in the course of time, her arms began to be free and limber. Her legs began to work like they were stumps. She started to begin to walk, and those stiff legs turned into limber legs. And within 25 minutes, I watched that woman move from total paralysis to being able to run across the field.
Wow.
It was one of the most incredible and astonishing miraculous healings I have ever seen. And that was one of about 50. That's the one that I can describe where I was close enough to be an eyewitness of the paralysis, where I'm not going to be exaggerating. This is exactly what I saw, and this is exactly what occurred. So, I mean, that sets into motion a whole series of thoughts around how healing prayer works. How is this for our present day? Yes, there is such a thing as the Lord's gift of healing, and miracles do happen. And they're supposed to be more common than they currently are. And so the skeptical mind, trained in Western thinking with empirical thought as the background and science as the primary means by which we judge reality, really has a hard time bridging the gap to come over to the idea that God can be a healer. And so that's why I wrote this one here, this book called Healing Prayer. I know you have that one. You could hold that one up too.
Yep.
This one is a co-write. Yeah, there you go. It's a co-write, and the other writer is Dr. Maxie Dunham. And Maxie Dunham is the past president of Asbury Theological Seminary, a very solid theological institution in Middle America. It's in Kentucky. And he was in that role for many years. And he's retired from that role now. He's getting up in years. But he and I wrote this book because we wanted to talk about how healing prayer works. And it starts with him and I being skeptics. So you're talking about how do you handle a skeptic? Well, because I tripped into prayer for healing, it wasn't my idea.
Yeah, and
The very
that was
first
one of the
experience.
questions I was going to ask you for this, David, is for those skeptics that are out there, and obviously, I haven't read your book yet, but I have it here. It's in the queue. But, that was one of the things that I wanted to know is how do you go from skeptic to being a believer? Is it
Well, let me
actually
tell you how it
witnessing
worked.
it or, yeah, go ahead.
Well, the bottom line was I had the only person I'd ever seen. And so I became a Christ follower when I was 16 years old. And the story is dramatic. I had an unclean spirit cast out of me. That's what happened. And I watched this unclean thing fly out of me and go straight through a wall, and I had a vision of light. So I knew supernatural was real. Okay. So from 16 until I'm 23, how many years is that? 7? I had
Yeah,
not
sounds right.
seen, a miraculous healing. I'd never saw one. Listen, here's what happened. When I became a believer, I was the first believer in my family, and I started checking out every kind of Christian. So I went to sacramental churches like Anglican and Catholic and Lutheran, and I went to classical evangelical churches like Baptist and Presbyterian, and I went to charismatic assemblies like Pentecostal and Vineyard and all those kinds of things. I went to every kind of Christian thing I could imagine because I had a real hunger and a thirst to understand how this worked, and I couldn't get my nose out of the Bible. But here was the thing that was the hard part for me. In 7 years of being with sacramentalists, classical evangelicals, and charismatics, the three main streams of the Lord's church, I met all kinds of people who believed in divine healing, but I didn't meet one person who had been healed. Not one. There was one possible case. I went to a Bible study with a brethren elder kind of thing. And there was a young lady in that group, and her parents were there, and her sister was there, and her two brothers. So the whole family came to this Bible study. She had been involved in a head on collision 2 years before I met her. And apparently, she had head injuries. She had 53 bones smashed. She had her lungs pierced by broken bone tissue, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And her heart stopped beating at the side of the road because of this head on collision. And I met her when she was quite hale and hearty, and you didn't even see a mark of that kind of trauma on her when I met her. And her family, her father, her mother, her sister, her two brothers, all told me that Jesus had healed her. But it was very medical. So here's what happened: the head-on collision took place, and a neighbor was driving down the road coming home from work and saw the accident up ahead, recognized the car, recognized the girl, just as the EMS guy said, "She's dead." Her heart stopped beating. And that man, who was a Christian believer, stopped and said, "Don't stop working. Let me pray." And he prayed, and suddenly her heart started beating again. And then she recovered. All 53 bones were miraculously healed. She was actually an attractive young lady. And you would not have seen any evidence that she had been in that kind of a traumatic event. She still had some headaches. And over the course of the next couple of years, as I attended that event, the headaches vanished to the point where she was completely healed. Absolutely, totally. But it was so medical. It was medical. So I said, well, the EMS guys were there at the side of the road. They had the jolt things with the electric, and they tried to get her heart started. And my thought in my head was, so what?
Yeah. So you were
This
probably
guy
thinking,
prayed.
okay, hey, he took a prayer, right? But medically, they did everything they could and got her heart beating again.
That's it. So I couldn't say definitively that girl was healed by Jesus. I couldn't say that. I could say, it's possible. Isn't this amazing? And I'm thankful. But that was the only, in 7 years, from 16 to 23, that's the first one I saw. It's the only one I saw. But here's the thing. I would read the Bible, and Jesus was doing this. Now, the Bible also talked about something like forgiveness, for example. And I could see the effect of forgiveness. It didn't matter if the people were young or older, in between. It didn't matter male or female. I could see in a second that the power of forgiveness was real because these people tasted it and they did it. But I could not see the evidence of physical healing. But it was in the Bible, so it was an article of faith. So here's the story. So I go to 7. This story is the first story in my healing prayer book. In fact, I'd like to make a gift to your listeners. I'd like to send the audio file for the first chapter of the book to your group, and they can listen to me and Maxie tell the first chapter of the book at no charge. I'd like to do that for your group.
Oh, nice.
Anyway,
Excellent.
I'll do that quickly. But regardless of this, in the story, here's what happened. I went to a liberal mainline seminary, and the faculty were mixed. There were some who were supernaturalists, and there were some who were not. And I remember going into a class, and there was a cohort of about 30 students with me. We all had 3 classes in common. And I remember the prof got up and said, oh, you know that story about Jesus walking on the water? We don't need him to actually walk on the water to get the application point. And I put my hand up and I said, wait a minute. I just want you to know this. I do believe that that's historically accurate, that Jesus did walk on the water. And why should we throw out the history as well as the application? Anyway, the prof was about to respond, but in the class, there was this magnificent comedian. And you got to know, the guy was hilarious. He had been a radio talk show host, and he had this interactive kind of thing where he was always telling jokes at the drop of a hat. And when he told a joke, it was always hilarious. It was incongruity to beat the band. And everybody would laugh until they were sore at their sides because it was hilarious. So he stands up after I say the Bible's true, and he cracks a joke, and the whole room explodes in laughter. Everybody was laughing so hard. The trouble was, he made fun of my faith as the point of the joke. So you laugh it off the first time, and you go to your next class, and then something happened where I defended the integrity of the scripture. And once again, he rose up and he cracked the joke, and everybody laughed, but it was at my expense again. And this went on for several weeks until finally I said to myself, yep, he's not going to be my friend.
Yeah, right.
So, now, what are you going to do with that? You stuck with the class with him, so I was careful around him. Anyway, here's what happened. 2-3 months in, I was going to a class, and I bumped into a classmate. I call her Susie in the book because I've lost touch with her. But regardless of that, she said, "Oh, you know the comedian in our class." I said, "Oh yeah, I know the comedian." She said, "You see that hospital 6 blocks down the road, the University Hospital there in Toronto?" I said, "Yeah, I know the hospital." She said, "Well, he's in there." I'll just tell you this, Nathan. My first response was, I'm not sad. then I had to repent of my stinking lovely attitude. I had to repent of my bad attitude. So after I repented of my bad attitude, I said, okay, what's wrong? And she said this, he's got phlebitis. Now, your listeners may not know what that is. That is where an embolism or a clot forms inside a vein in your arm or wherever. And if the clot breaks free and travels through your bloodstream and gets to your heart, your lung, or your brain,
you're done.
98 times out of 100, you're dead. It's very serious. And he had this. He's only 27. He had this. And so I said, oh, I'm so sorry. Is he getting good care? Was my first question. She said, yeah, he's in that hospital down there. I said, okay, well, I'm glad he's getting good care. And I was about to go to my class, and she stopped me and she said, I have something to say to you from him. I went to see him last night. I said, okay, what does he want? She said, he wants you to come and pray for him. I said, what?
This guy who laughs at my expense?
He's been making fun of me. And I said, look, I talked to her. I said, I'm not going. He wants to mock me. He's setting me up for more of this mockery. Every single time I've said anything about the Bible being true, he has mocked me in front of our peers and made me look like a wooden deadhead. That's what he's looked like, And so she nodded, and she was a very sweet, kind lady. And she said, you're right. He's been cruel. I said, well, yes, he has. And she said, I will talk to him. I said, thank you very much. And away I went to my class. And the next day in the coffee lounge at school, I see the same. And she said, oh, I went to see him. He's terribly sorry. He wants you to come and pray. And I said, I'm not going. And then she said, why not? I said, I think he's setting me up for a joke. He doesn't believe in this kind of stuff. It's very clear. And I didn't go. And the third time I saw her the next day. I don't know if you've ever been told off by your mother, but this girl got the
more than I probably should have, right?
She stomped her feet on the ground and she looked me in the eye and she used my middle initial. She said, David R. Chotka. Oh, man. And then she said, aren't you going around this school telling everybody the Bible's the word of God and it's supposed to be obeyed? I said, yes. She said, well, what about this scripture? I was sick and you visited me. And suddenly a fell blow landed in the center of my being. Oh, no, I'm going to have to go and see the guy out of sheer obedience to that text. And I looked at her. Now, remember, I had never seen anybody healed. I took it as an article of faith, but I had no training. I was greener than your average rookie. And I was terrified that he was going to make fun of me. So these three things were in this scream of I'm not going. But now I was convicted because the Bible said I had to, and I better obey the Bible. Then I looked at her and I said, it says sick and visited. It doesn't say sick and prayed. She said, I don't care which one you do. Ask for you to go, so you go. So this was the defining moment, and I'd never seen it before, and I'd never done it before, and I didn't know anybody who had been, apart from that one girl with the car accident. So I go into this hospital room, and he's hooked up to all these monitors and all of this, his heart things on the screen, and they're monitoring his oxygen levels, and they're making sure that he's got a drip line inside him, so he's getting the antibiotic or whatever it's called, the anticoagulant, and they had to be very careful with it because if too much it breaks free, he's dead. So they had to just very gently, very slowly do this. Anyway, I see him, and I talked to him about the weather, and then he said, "Oh, well, I can't see the weather. I'm inside." Then I talked to him about the courses he was in. And then I said, "Well, I visited you now. I have fulfilled the biblical command. I'm going to go." He said, "Wait, aren't you going to pray?" And I looked at him and I said, "Look, I've got to get something straight before I do this. Every single time I have said anything about the Bible being true, you have turned and made fun of my faith. You've mocked me. You've made me look like a brain-dead idiot in front of our peers. Why should you even want me to be in the room with you?" And this 27-year-old man burst into tears. He just started to hacking sobs and crying. And he said, "I am so terribly sorry I did that to you. But I have phlebitis. I'm 27 years old and I could die. And then he said this, "You're the only guy I know who believes that every word in that book is true. Won't you please pray that your Jesus heal me?" What are you going to say? I mean,
Yeah.
now I'm dumbfounded.
Yeah, you
I
can't
still don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah. Are you going to say, "Nope,
All
sorry"?
I've seen, no. All I've seen is the crazies on television screaming and slapping people on the forehead and throwing hankies in the air.
Like the Ernest Angeles and stuff, right? Yeah.
I just didn't think that was helpful. But I thought, okay, the Bible does say Jesus put his hands on people. So I said, "Well, can I put my hand over the spot?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Where is it?" He said, "Left arm above the elbow." Here's what happened. I get to the edge of his bed. I put my hand over his arm, over his head, and I prayed this pathetic, honest prayer. And suddenly the atmosphere in the room changed. The only way I can describe it was like the whole room filled with compassion, and I was inhaling that. And fiery presence entered into my heart and my soul and my mind, and focus. The only thing I could see was him, and I was aware of the power of the Lord, and I had this yearning for him to become well, joined together with a compassion for this man who was only 27. And suddenly that fire rose up inside of me, and then it flowed through my arm and went into his arm. And then he said, "What is that fire coming into my arm?" I said, "That's the presence of the Holy Spirit. He's healing you." And I raced out of the room after that. I'll tell you why. I was terrified. I'd never felt
Yeah, you
anything.
never experienced it.
Never. I'd never know. I didn't know that was real. But it happened while I was praying for this man. And the next day, 4:00 in the afternoon, I was in a class. I came out from the class went from 2 to 4. I came out of the class at 4:00, and there he was in the coffee lounge of the school. And I said,
Healed.
"You're here." He said, "Yes, I am." And then he shoved me into a corner. And then he looks in every direction. And then he says, "I have to tell you something." I said, "What's that?" He said, "That prayer changed my life." And I said, "Thank you." And I ran away again because I was afraid he was going to mock me. And so the next time I was in class with him and I defended the scripture, he stood up and he told a joke and he made fun of not believing the Bible. And everybody in the class exploded in laughter, but the object of the humor was unbelief, not faith.
Wow.
And for the next several months, he did that. And then we had a summer field. Now, so that part of the story, the part that I've told you just now, up to this point, is in the Healing Prayer Book. It's chapter 1. Okay. But the part I'm going to tell you now is not in the book. So we were required by the denomination to do a summer field. And that's where you'd go to some location in somewhere, and you'd be under the oversight of a seasoned pastor who would then give you opportunity to exercise your ministry under his watch, and he'd teach and correct you and that kind of thing. It was 4 months of that. Anyway, but just before I'm about to go in the summer field, this guy raises up to me and presses a phone number in my hand. He said, "That's my phone number." I said, "What do you want me to do?" He said, "If you're in trouble, you call. I said, "Oh, okay." And I had a marvelous summer, had no trouble. And I came back in September to get ready for school again. And he raced over to me and said, "You didn't call." I said, "Well, I didn't have any trouble."
Yeah,
he said,
I didn't have
trouble. You call. And so anyway, a couple months in, there's a party for the students. We're doing a social thing. And there's the spot where you get the punch, and you stand there and
Yeah.
you shoot the breeze and tell stories. So I walked over, and there he was with his lovely wife and this girl who had asked me, who was friends with his wife and him. Anyway, I'm standing next to them shooting the breeze about harmless nothings. It was one of those parties. And as he looks at the two girls, and the two girls look at him, and they both start giving him the elbow. They said, "You got to tell Chotka what happened. You got to tell Chotka what happened." He said, "I don't want to tell Chotka what happened." So anyway, after about 5 minutes of cajoling, he said, "This is what took place. Right after you left the room, the charge nurse walked in. She had my medication in hand, and he said to her, 'I can go home now. Jesus has healed me. My friend from the Bible school, he's come and prayed for me. The Lord has touched me. My body's well.'" And the lady said, "We don't do that around here."
Yeah, I don't think so.
And then he said, "What do you got to do?" She said, "We got to run tests." He said, "Run them." She said, "Well, you're due, so I'm going to take you down the hall. We'll run the tests." So he was actually on time for that kind of roster of tests anyway. So they conducted and every trace of phlebitis from his body was gone. There wasn't
Wow.
any in his body. And so they were astonished. They ran the tests again. Every trace of phlebitis was gone. Second round of test. So they called his wife and said, "You can come and get your guy. He's well." He shows, and he goes home, and he's never experienced anything like this before. He tells his wife, and both of them are grateful. So they kneel down beside their bed, and they do something. They prayed together for the first time at the side of their bed, and they thanked God that the Lord had healed him. And they fell asleep hugging because he almost died, So they're
Yeah.
holding each other close, and they love each other. He has a dream in the night, and in the dream, a voice speaks, and it says, "My servant David defends the integrity of my scripture, and no one stands with him. When he defends the authority of the Bible, you defend him." And he did all through the remainder of our time at theological seminary. 30 years after he was healed, 30 years, 30, I had changed denominations. I had a new church in a new area of the country. He found me and sent me a note and thanked me because I was faithful to the Bible. And he had become a pastor. He had 3 kids. He raised them to adulthood. They were married. He was now retiring. He was older than me. He was retiring now. And he wanted to thank God that God had preserved his life. So that story was the thing that caused my skepticism to turn to belief.
To turn to belief. And
You participate in something like that, you can't go to a place of unbelief.
no,
You can't.
would you say, Dr. Chaka, that all of us have the ability to have that, to pray for healing?
Yes, I would. That's why I wrote the book. And so what I've done, so I think this is not a matter of the reason it's called healing prayers. I didn't say healing miracles. I said
Yeah.
healing prayer because, and it says God's idea for restoring body, mind, and spirit. The title is deliberately chosen. It wasn't my idea to do that prayer. I didn't want to be there.
Yep.
Thank you very much. It
Yeah.
was not my idea to enter
You know,
into discuss. And every time I was involved in one of these supernatural events, it wasn't my idea. So what I wanted to teach is that it's God's idea. Prayer is God's idea. And the creation changing based upon the prayers of God's people is God's idea. It's not our idea. And all
yep.
true prayer that has an answer is rooted and grounded in the fact that God initiates and we respond. Healing prayer is God's idea. And what
Absolutely.
I do in the book, so Maxie Dunham, my co-writer, tells the story of the healing of his grandson. And he was unsure about this healing prayer thing. And for years, he didn't see any healing prayer. I didn't see any healing prayer. And here's what happened. His daughter had a child, little boy. And the little boy was born with nystagmus. His eyes were vibrating back and forth very rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult for someone with nystagmus to be able to see clearly. And
Yes.
underneath, there was another medical condition called optic nerve hypoplasia, which is where your optic nerve is it's half the size it should be. It's very thin, and it might fail. And the prospects are blindness. That's about it. You might have a 10% chance of some vision, but it was bad. So, of course, Kim, Maxie's daughter, is married to a medical doctor, a urologist. He's a medical doctor. And so they know about medicine and they live in the medical field and they would diagnose illness, et cetera, et cetera. So she was a doctor of theology. He was a medical doctor. They had education coming out of their pores and they knew that their son was destined to be blind and, or at least very badly sighted. And, you know,
Right.
this medical doctor gives the stories in the book too. At any rate, what happened is Maxie, who was the head of the Upper Room Publishing House, had a prayer cell, prayer groups all over the country, all over the United States and around the world. And so he sent a note out saying, my grandson, Nathan, has been born with this medical condition. It's genetic, and we are asking God for a healing. And he didn't feel any particular kind of anointing or anything like this. He just got a whole bunch of people to pray. Now, a year later, Kim's husband got a medical scholarship to go to a different city to learn urology. And so he was doing this specialization, and he moved together with his new wife and their son. And they go to this place, and she brings the medical files with her because they needs an eye doctor. So she goes to the eye doctor, presents the medical file, and says, why don't you examine my son and see how he's doing? So he looks in his eyes and says, oh, yeah, those eyes are fine. And then says, yep, that optic nerve, that's really healthy. And she said, no, that's impossible. And so she passes the file to the new medical doctor, and he reads it. He knows the other doctor. And as it turns out, he says, this is medically impossible. That can't be healed. There must have been a misdiagnosis. She said, no, there was no misdiagnosis. My husband is a medical doctor too. He asked thorough questions. We got a second opinion. No, the kid has optic nerve hypoplasia and nystagmus. He said, the nystagmus is almost gone and then the optic nerve is fine. Anyway, they went to another doctor, had the same examination, and the result was the child was healed. And the reason why we wrote the book was because Maxie came up to the anniversary of the healing. Then he told a bunch of people and said, oh, by the way, my grandson's getting married. And now the grandson has a child. And so he remembered this healing prayer story and consented to write the book with me. And so it was a miracle. Now, in my case, it was an instant heal where I felt tangible expressions of power. In Maxie's case, it was a gradual heal over a period of a year where a bunch of people who were praying across the country simply did so, some of them out of duty, some of them out of affection for Maxie, whatever. Some of them didn't know the kids, some of them were aware of the family, but regardless, they prayed. And the healing came.
And God answered.
Yeah, God answered. That's the best way to describe this.
And I mean, you know, and that's one of the things too, and I think you brought up a good point there, Dr. Chotka, is that God answers in his own time. Right. So he does what he sees best for you, you know. So like in your case, it was almost an instant healing. Right. But then in this child's case, it was over a little bit of time, but God still answered the prayer and gave the same results just in different ways.
That's right. That's right. So listen, so the reason why we wrote the book was because both of us started from a place of unbelief and tripped into this thing when we didn't particularly want to. We didn't have didn't have any desire to do this. So we wrote the book for people like me and him. We didn't know what to do. You know, it was this crazy kind of thing. That's why we wrote the book, and it's intended to be a manual that people will use so that they can, first of all, learn how to do this, and secondly, they can practice it in their churches. There's 15 chapters in the book, and if you buy the book and you send me a note, I will send you 15 YouTube videos, one for each chapter, so that a Bible study group can look at how this works and you can discover how to put it to work and so on. So the book is intended to be it's published by Whitaker House. So this book is available anywhere books are sold. So you get on Amazon, you get on Books A Million. You can get it at...
Yeah, thanks. That's where I was going to go next, David, is, you know, where can our listeners, because I know we're getting kind of close to time. I know you've got another appointment, but where can our listeners go? I know we've got Spirit Equip Ministries is still going strong, right?
Yeah, spiritequip.com. So spirit like Holy Spirit and equip like equipment. Put the two words together, spiritequip.com. That will take you to my website where I've got 4 books on display there, and you can get links to my spot. Or if you want this one in particular, you put in my name, David Chotka. And Google will take you to Healing Prayer at Whitaker House, or it will take you to the other books that I've written as well. And you can walk up to Walmart if you want to, and you can order Healing Prayer because this book's available anywhere books are sold.
Yeah, that's awesome because I think I got mine through your website, but I noticed like on Amazon, you can follow authors as well. This is just something
Yes,
that I noticed. And so I started following you, David, because, we're friends. You're friends of the show. You've been here a couple of times now. Hopefully we'll do it a few more times. But yeah, it's amazing because then when you do publish a new book and if it does go on to Amazon, boom, you get an instant notification saying, hey, Dr. Chotka wrote a new book.
that's
And
right.
then we can go buy it.
There's
Yeah.
three more in the works. One on the
Yep.
dealing with the powers of darkness, one on Mark's gospel, and a short form on the Lord's Prayer. They're in the works. So
I love it.
the short form of the Lord's Prayer is going to come out this year, and the Mark's gospel one will come out early in the new year. That's when that's going to happen. And so
Excellent.
we're in a good spot with that.
Excellent.
Well,
Well, Dr. Chuck, is there anything else you want to leave us with as we wrap up things today?
well, you know what I'm going to say? God's desire to answer your prayer is greater than your desire to pray it. And all that it takes is a desire to practice what you know for you to get to the place where these things start to happen with frequency.
Well, folks, that's a wrap on another epic episode of Just a Dude podcast. Man, Dr. David Chotka, you dropped some serious wisdom on us today. Thanks for coming back and making us all feel a little bit closer to the big guy upstairs. For all you listeners out there, check out David's books like Healing Prayer and Living the Lord's Prayer One Step at a Time. Among others, these are definitely some game changers. And swing by spiritequip.com to dive into his courses and resources. All right, dudes, keep it real, keep the faith, and we'll catch you next time on Just a Dude podcast.